Hello, welcome back to Busch History. I am David Busch, and this is topic 27. We're going to be dealing with the 1970s and the presidencies of Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. It's always important to understand people in context. Where are they in history and how do they fit? History is like a big puzzle. I like to use a mosaic sometimes, but it also is like a puzzle sometimes in that things just seem to fit together well. One of the things that we have to understand when taking a look at Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, two presidents who history does not shine on as being specifically strong presidents, and understand why they became president and why they're not looked at as being terribly strong presidents. It's important to understand the time period. Let's take just a quick look at how we got here. We have to remember how we got to Gerald Ford. 1963, we have the assassination of John Kennedy. And that was a terrible, terrible blow to the American psyche. What are we going to do? The King of Camelot is dead. And who do we get? We get Lyndon Johnson. We get Lyndon Johnson, who had all of the desire to be a great president. And in the time, he was not looked at as such. History is changing its opinion on Lyndon Johnson, but nevertheless, he is blamed for the escalation in Vietnam. The hey, 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 LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? And ultimately, Lyndon Johnson's presidency is looked at as a failed presidency, and he steps down in 1968. He decides not to run for president again, and then who do we get in 1969? We get Richard Nixon. Another presidency that in the day is looked at as a failed, troubled presidency. He quietly escalates the Vietnam War by going to Laos and Cambodia. Of course, we find it out. Then we have the whole debacle of the Pentagon Papers, and then the bigger debacle of Watergate. And now people think that we have a crook as president, and he steps down in August of 1974. And the other thing that we have to remember as well about Richard Nixon and his presidency is that his Vice President Agnew, also had to step down for bribery and tax evasion. So when President Nixon nominated Gerald Ford to be his vice president, he was looking for a good, decent, honest man. Someone once told me that people who are dishonest and people who are criminals, they often like to have their picture taken with really honest people. And you might want to say that about Richard Nixon. We debate his policies and whatnot, but we know that at the end of his presidency was looked at as a failure. And who does he seek to surround himself with? The most likable, honest guy we could find in those days, and that was Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford, congressman from Michigan, very well liked guy. And when Spiro Agnew steps down to fight his bribery and tax evasion charges, Nixon nominates Gerald Ford to be his vice president. So now Gerald Ford is Nixon's vice president while Nixon is going through the whole Watergate debacle. And then when Nixon steps down in August of 1974, Gerald Ford becomes President Ford, which is a very interesting set of events. So let's take a look at the Ford presidency, 1974 to 1977, an unusual term of office. An unusual term of office because it wasn't a real term. He wasn't elected to be vice president with Nixon, and strange enough, he wasn't elected president either. He's the only president to never get an electoral vote. He never ran for president with Nixon originally. So here we have a president of the United States who was never voted for by anybody. Do you think that's going to be an easy presidency? And he picks Nelson Rockefeller, who had been the governor of New York, to be his vice president. So now we have a president and a vice president who was never voted for by anyone. But that wasn't his big problem. Let's take a look at what happens while Gerald Ford is president. First, he replaces Nixon on August 9th, on August 9th, 1974. As I said, it's the only president never to be elected. But this was a good, decent, honest man. The country needed him after the slain president, the debacle of the Vietnam War, and Watergate. We needed somebody honest, trustworthy, and likable. And that's who Gerald Ford was. One of the first things he said was the healing process must begin. We have to get past this cloud of Watergate. He was very popular. Some people call his presidency the lame duck presidency because he didn't have that mandate that so many presidents need. Not every president gets a mandate. He didn't even have a vote. So that was going to make it very tough on Gerald Ford. From hero to goat, the Nixon pardon. So here he comes. Here he comes. He's going to clean up Washington. He's going to clean up Washington. He's going to erase the stain of Watergate. At the beginning of Ford's presidency, Time magazine noted a mood of good feeling and even exhilaration was present in Washington. Yes, it's going to get better. I remember this. Ford was looked at as the savior. He was going to make things better. Well, after a month in office, Gerald Ford issues a pardon to Richard Nixon for any and all crimes he may have committed. Now, a pardon, by the way, is official forgiveness for a crime. But you have to be convicted before you can get official forgiveness. Well, the public wanted his pound of flesh. They wanted Richard Nixon to go on trial. And Gerald Ford decided that was a bad idea, to put a former president on trial. First of all, the whole idea of having Nixon testify, while we may have wanted that, would have been very ugly. And if Nixon had been convicted, are they really sending Richard Nixon to jail? Can you imagine what that would have been like? The guy who was president when the first man walked on the moon. The guy who was president when normalcy started to occur between China and the United States. The guy who was president when the Vietnam War came to a close with American involvement. We're going to put him in jail. So, what happened was, Gerald Ford issued this pardon. Now what happens here is, though, the American public is very skeptical. Was there a deal? Did President Nixon, on the eve of stepping down, call Gerald Ford into the office and say, okay, Jerry, you want to be President of the United States, and I got to get out of here. So I tell you what, I'll make you a deal. I'll make you President if you pardon me. Not right away, a little bit down the road so people don't think we connected it. Well, that's what Americans felt. It was felt that a deal was made and Ford pardoned Nixon. Now, Ford's likability may have held on, but his credibility dropped way down. And people were very upset. The decision proved to be unpopular for both Republicans and Democrats. The Republicans wanted to prove that they were not just a party that stood together, but they were a party for truth. And the Democrats, well, they wanted to get Richard Nixon. So this is a very, very bad situation for Gerald Ford. And on top of it, shortly along we get Saturday Night Live. And Saturday Night Live, 11:30 Saturday night, is going to lampoon Gerald Ford incredibly. Gerald Ford was not the most coordinated person. He was thought to be a klutz. There are images and video of him falling down the steps getting off of Air Force One. He was playing in a golf tournament, and on one occasion, he swung his club and let go of it, and it went into the crowd and hurt someone. So Chevy Chase got his start picking on Gerald Ford. Well, so Gerald Ford looked like a nice guy, but he looked like a bumbling boob who pardoned a criminal president. That was not going to work well for his presidency. He also has to deal with an economy that can't get out of its own way. We have something here called stagflation. Stagflation is a strange idea. I mentioned this previously when talking about Richard Nixon. Generally speaking, when you get high inflation, you get high employment. They tend to go together. More money in the economy, more jobs being created. But that wasn't what stagflation was. Stagflation was high inflation and low employment, or, worded differently, high inflation and high unemployment. Wasn't supposed to go that way. Wasn't supposed to go that way, because normally when you have a lot of money in circulation, you have a lot of demand pull, meaning people are buying lots of stuff, and that creates lots of jobs. Wasn't occurring, and Gerald Ford, like Richard Nixon, couldn't figure out what to do about it. But he's going to try some simple things. Remember, he's a Republican, so he's not for super activist government. So he's trying to figure out, what do I do about this? Prior to Gerald Ford's presidency, Nixon was unable to control inflation and unemployment. Stagflation. By 1974, both inflation and unemployment were rising, making the economy stagnant. There was so what happened was, Gerald Ford enacted a 5% income tax increase on the wealthy and less government spending. Now think about that. If you're going to increase taxes on the wealthy, he wants to curtail spending a little bit. So if you increase taxes on the wealthy by 5%, that's 5% of money they can't now spend. And if you're going to cut government spending, that means that's less money the government's going to spend. But the problem is, especially when the government cuts 5% spending, or cuts spending I should say, you're going to increase unemployment. So it doesn't work. He comes up with a slogan, whip inflation now or win. Now we had these badges and signs and stuff like that. You know, it said whip inflation now, Gerald Ford, 1974. And he said, what we have to do is we got to stop spending. So he tried to convince people to voluntarily stop spending. Don't spend so much money. What were people going to do? They needed to buy things. It wasn't like we were in this overdrive consumer economy at the time. It was that prices were high and things cost a lot of money. So the more money you spent, the higher prices went, etc., etc. And the economy couldn't get out of its own way. What also is going on here, he's dealing with a Democratic Congress that's not very happy with him. So Ford is struggling. Ford is struggling, trying to figure out what to do. One of the things that we know about Gerald Ford is, in classical Republican ideology, he doesn't believe in an overly activist government. He believes in more individual responsibility, and the government should kind of step out of the way a bit. So although Ford was generally against government spending, he supported an increase in unemployment benefits, because if unemployment is rising and people can't buy things, then that doesn't do good for more jobs being created. So he decides that he's going to okay an increase in unemployment benefits. Then in January of 1975, he has the Tax Reduction Act of 1975, and he's going to cut taxes by $22 billion, hoping to inject more money into the economy. Because if we don't pay taxes, we have more money to spend. But the problem is, inflation is rising. The more money being spent, the more inflation is going to rise. So again, can't figure this out. This isn't working the way it's supposed to work. The Democrats wanted more government jobs. They wanted a bigger role in the economy. They wanted the government to fix it. But the Democrats really didn't have a better idea either. This is one of those anomalies in economics that just didn't seem to make sense, and Ford was struggling with it. And of course, if you're unemployed, or if you're paying a fortune, Ford used to pay a lot less, you're going to blame the presidents. Now, one very interesting thing, kind of out of the way of all of this, was a new law, Public Law 94-142. And what Public Law 94-142 did was create equal access to education for people with handicapping conditions. Basically, it created the special education programs that we know now exist in schools throughout the nation. That regardless of who you are, or regardless of what your handicapping condition, you were entitled to an education. So that starts during the Ford administration. It sounds like a fairly liberal Democratic idea, but it's Gerald Ford. And Gerald Ford is not a party partisan when it comes to politics. He's a good guy trying to figure it out, and it's just not going so well for him. He battled with Congress on a regular basis because Congress wanted it fixed. Congress has a lot of big Republicans and a lot of big Democrats that are yelling at him. They want their president to get it right, and it's just not going so well. His foreign policy. His foreign policy is basically the leftover foreign policy of the Nixon years. He's dealing with Vietnam. Vietnam, we think it's over. as a young teenager in these days, I think Vietnam is over. It's not. It's not. Vietnam was in a ceasefire. So what happens is, on December 13th, 1974, the North Vietnamese invade South Vietnam again. They're coming back. They're coming back, and what does South Vietnam do? South Vietnam asks the United States for help. President Nixon had made a secret deal. Why not? He had made a secret deal with the government of South Vietnam that if the North Vietnamese engage again, if they invade, that we will also engage again, and we'll jump back in, and the whole game will start all over again. So Ford goes to Congress and says, I want to help South Vietnam. And Congress says no. And largely the American public applauds the idea. There's no way we're going to re-engage in Vietnam. But Nixon got the South Vietnamese to go along with the peace accords because he promised we wouldn't. Of course, that's not going to happen. So what do we have to do now? Well, as a result of the 1973 peace accords with Vietnam, we still have an embassy in South Vietnam, in Saigon, and we still have a small military presence in South Vietnam. We don't have a military presence that's large enough to put off the North Vietnamese, but we have still a military presence, and we control the air base and whatnot in South Vietnam. So, without the ability to help the South Vietnamese, President Ford orders a full-scale evacuation of Americans and American friendlies, people who had been friendly to the American military and the American government in South Vietnam. And it's called Operation Frequent Wind. And I don't know where they get these names from, to be frank with you, but what that really is going to be an evacuation of South Vietnam. And it's going to be an evacuation on live television. And we're going to see images like this. This is an American helicopter landing on an American aircraft carrier. I'll show you more images in a second, evacuating people from Vietnam. And these evacuations are going on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, starting in 1975. And it was very, very ugly. South Vietnam falls on April 30th, 1975. And it falls to the North. So now the North conquers the South. They're going to change the name of Saigon to Ho Chi Minh City, because after all, Ho Chi Minh is their version of George Washington. He fought the Japanese, he fought the French, and he was fighting the Americans. So they're going to name Saigon Ho Chi Minh City, and we are left in a situation where we look like a big failure. I want to share some images with you. So here we have, this is a museum in the northern part of present-day Vietnam with captured American warplanes. So we left our warplanes behind. We couldn't get them out of Vietnam at the end. We have Hue City, H-U-E is pronounced Hue, Hue City in 1968 during the Tet Offensive. And what we have here is soldiers looking a little confused and wounded as well. This is My Lai in 1968. This is the My Lai massacre, and this is the ditch where the bodies where they fell into once they were machine gunned. And Agent Orange, the idea that, well, we'll get them out of the trees and out of the jungles by using this defoliant. And this was sprayed from helicopters onto the jungles, trying to kill all the vegetation so we could see where the bad guys are. And the question remained, how could we lose? Look at this firepower. Look at these helicopters. They called Vietnam the television war because we saw it constantly, and they also called it the helicopter war because we would fly into and out of places dropping American firepower. So it was wondered, how could we lose? Look at this mechanization, I should say. But nevertheless, we certainly didn't win. And then we have the futility of the firepower. I remember these images like they were yesterday. What happened was, as helicopters were going to aircraft carriers in the South China Sea and depositing American friendlies, and American friendlies again, they were South Vietnamese who had helped Americans, and they certainly were Americans still living in South Vietnam. After a while, the aircraft carriers got so filled with people that it was difficult to land the helicopters. And also, the helicopters were starting to run out of fuel. Once we lost the air bases in South Vietnam, Da Nang, one of them, once we lost the air bases, we couldn't refuel our helicopters anymore. So this helicopter is simply being pushed overboard. A perfectly good helicopter being pushed into the South China Sea to make room for more refugees. This is not the image that the United States wants the world to think of when they think of American military power. And then we have maybe the saddest of all images. This image requires a bit of narration. An American helicopter, an American Marine on the roof, and these are Vietnamese refugees being put on this helicopter to be taken out to the aircraft carriers in the South China Sea. The helicopter is not supposed to land there. This is the roof of the American embassy. But what had happened was, down below, this is still a roof, coming up to a higher roof, down below in the campus of what had been the American embassy, the refugees had knocked down the gates. There were so many hundreds of people trying to get out of Vietnam, trying to get away from the encroaching North Vietnamese, and the American Marines were unable to control the compound and own the ground, so to speak, so the helicopters could land. So now the helicopters are landing on a very precarious perch on the roof, and still, this is a ladder going up to the roof of the American embassy, and this helicopter is perched there, kind of very precariously, taking these people off to the aircraft carriers in the South China Sea. So this is very, very tough. This is not the sign of a strong military. This is the sign of futility. On the heels of the debacle in Vietnam, we have the Maya Gez incident. The Maya Gez was a freighter, and it was an American freighter, and it was seized by the Cambodians in 1975, specifically May 12th, 1975. The Americans were looking weak. The Cambodian government wasn't happy with us because of the whole bombing of Cambodia under Richard Nixon. Anyway, so they're going to seize an American freighter. And Gerald Ford orders Marines to get that freighter back. He doesn't want to look weak. And in the debacle of getting it back, and we do get it back, 41 American lives are lost. So now more American lives are lost in in Southeast Asia after the Vietnam War is over. He's also going to continue to normalize relations with China, and we're going to continue to get closer to the People's Republic of China. We don't have full diplomatic recognition yet, but we're moving in that direction. And probably the high water mark in terms of foreign policy with the Ford administration are the Helsinki Accords in August of 1975. Helsinki, Finland. European countries got together to affirm their commitment to each other and to affirm their commitment to human rights and civil rights. And that was a really cool thing. In terms of the USSR, the Soviet Union, détente is continuing. We are following the SALT Treaty, and SALT talks are going to continue, and they're going to continue through the Carter administration, where we're going to end up with something called SALT II. And then there was the birthday party. The nation turned 200 years old under Gerald Ford. It's called a bicentennial celebration. And it was just one big nationwide party. Lots of flags waving, special coins were printed, and I remember very well there was things called Operation Sail, Op Sail in New York, where ships from around the world came to New York. They sailed past the Statue of Liberty to celebrate the United States birthday. So it was a very, very happy time, and the United States needed a party after what had been going on for so long in the United States government, in the executive branch, in Vietnam. So this was just a party, but it happened while Gerald Ford was president. Of course, we have Mickey Mouse here, 1776 to 1976. But Gerald Ford is not going to get another term as president. He's going to run for president in 1976, and he's going to be defeated by Jimmy Carter. Gerald Ford was damaged very badly by the idea of pardoning Richard Nixon. So what happens is, we want another honest guy. And remember, the beginning of the presentation, we're talking about people being honest, and we're talking about who do we want to lead the nation. Well, Jimmy Carter's going to come along, and he's going to be from the opposite party. He's going to be a Democrat. He's a Washington outsider. He's a peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia. He had been governor of Georgia. He had a degree in nuclear physics. So this is a very intelligent man. He'd been to Annapolis. He'd been to the Naval Academy in Annapolis. And now he wants to become president. And he had nothing to do with Washington. He was looked at as an outsider. And that's what people wanted. His big smile, lots of teeth. And they called him Jimmy. Jimmy's running for president. So Jimmy Carter. He's a Washington outsider. They call his presidency the down-home president. He was big on human rights. He was big on not using the military. High water marks for his presidency. The human rights diplomacy, the Panama Canal Treaty, Camp David Accords, low water mark. The Iranian hostage crisis, the Soviets invading Afghanistan. Stagflation is going to continue, and he's going to have something called a malaise speech. Let's take a look at him. So as mentioned previously, stagflation is going to continue, and he wants to try to stop it. He wants to try to stop this runaway economy. So what does he do? He cuts federal spending. An unusual thing for a Democrat to cut federal spending, generally on social programs, and of course it angers a lot of the Democrats, but he does it nevertheless. As bond prices fell and interest rates rose, the economy is getting worse and worse. People are seeing their money disappear in front of their eyes. Interest rates were sky high. In 1980, interest rates were bouncing around 12%, which is incredibly high. He also believes in less government, in deregulating the government, in deregulating business interests and having the government step back a little bit. Very undemocratic ideas. So Carter felt that government controls hurt competition, and he wanted to increase competition. Generally speaking, Democrats want more control. He wanted less. So what happens? His move toward deregulation and the reduction or removal of government controls affected the energy, railroad, trucking, and airline industries. He's going to let them just compete by themselves. Sounds great for capitalism, but what it also means is there's going to be less oversight by the government. The move, which continued during the next 2 years of his administration, angered many Democrats. Like, who is this guy? And he wouldn't compromise. He wouldn't compromise with people in the House of Representatives. He wouldn't compromise with people in the Senate. And you have to do that. You have to find a way. So he was the outsider, and he was going to do it his way. He was a micromanager. He wanted to know all the details. But what it really meant was we were going to have a presidency that was going to be mired in itself and almost can't get out of its own way. Energy issues, big problem while Carter was president. Take a look at this chart, if you can see it here. 1973 gas is just hovering around 40 cents a gallon. Now we say, wow, 40 cents a gallon. Well, by the time we hit 1980, it's about $1.20 a gallon. And you say $1.20 a gallon is inexpensive. But take a look at this. This is a 300% increase. From 40 to $1.20. It's a 300% increase in the price of gasoline throughout the 1970s. When Jimmy Carter becomes president, 1976, it's about 60 cents a gallon. It's a 100% increase. So people are not happy what's happening with the price of fuel during the 1970s. President Carter's answer is to conserve. Let's cut back. So what does he want to do? He wants Americans to use less air conditioning. He wants Americans to use less heat. He wants us to drive less. That's his solution. He blames us for the problem. Even if he's right, the people don't want to hear it. We do not like to be blamed for our problems. We want to blame somebody else. Most presidents did that. Jimmy Carter didn't. Jimmy Carter was probably the most honest president we have ever had. The people didn't really want honesty, though. They wanted someone to fix things. So the response to Carter's energy plan, states that produced oil and gas, they were fiercely opposed because that meant less income for their states. Texas, Alaska, and the like, they don't want people to use less energy. They want people to use more energy. The National Energy Act was passed in 1978, and it's all about increasing fuel economy for cars and increasing fuel economy in homes, meaning more insulation, more efficient appliances, and the like. The whole idea that we have energy efficiency, Energy Star ratings on appliances starts from the ideas of Jimmy Carter. And it was thought, prior to the Carter presidency, it was thought that we would use nuclear power. That nuclear power would solve things. But then we have 3 Mile Island. 3 Mile Island. 3 Mile Island is in Pennsylvania, and it was an island that was 3 miles long, hence 3 Mile Island. And it was a nuclear power plant. There was a nuclear power plant on the island, and it was called 3 Mile Island Nuclear Power Plant. And there was a partial meltdown that occurred while Jimmy Carter was president. And what happened was, a meltdown occurs when the containment area that holds the nuclear fuel starts to melt. When it gets too hot for the containment building. Because if let's just say there's a concrete base to this containment building. And if the nuclear material starts to get too hot and it melts through the concrete base, it's going to hit the cold soil below it. So the super hot nuclear material hits the cold soil, you're going to get a cloud. Like when you take a hot shower in a cooler bathroom, it's going to fog over. Well, we would get a nuclear cloud. And that was the fear of what was going to happen if 3 Mile Island melted down. There was a series of mistakes. There was a broken valve. There was some other things that went on, and there was some human error in this as well. But it didn't matter because we felt that this nuclear reactor was going to melt down. And because we felt it was going to melt down, there were mistakes made in how the meltdown was being handled. And here we have an image of Jimmy Carter with boots on. You know, there's all this radiation everywhere, but boots are going to work. With boots on, walking through the control room because he was a nuclear physicist. He understood what was happening. It was meant as a way to calm American fears. I don't really think it calmed anything, seeing the president at the site of his meltdown. But he was there, and he thought he should be active and part of it. What it really did was, it changed America. It took us away from the idea that our solution to our energy problem was going to be nuclear power, because we saw the potential of a problem, a serious problem. And you know, a few years later, we would have Chernobyl in the Soviet Union, kind of cementing those ideas. Other things Carter had to deal with. People who didn't want to go to Vietnam for issues of, they didn't believe in the war, they were afraid to go, they thought it was the wrong war, whatever the reason, those people called draft dodgers. And one of the things draft dodgers did was they would leave the country. Typically, they would go to Canada. And I remember this very well. My father was actually a war hero. I'm not going to go into that right now. But he was also disillusioned with Vietnam. And my brother, who is 7 years older than I am, was eligible to go to Vietnam if his name had been selected in the draft. Well, my father packed my brother's bags because if my brother's number had been called, my father was taking my brother to Canada. So people who were very patriotic, as my father was, were still against the Vietnam War, and they went to Canada. And that really caused a rift in American society, because there was the one side that said, you're an American, you're drafted, you go and you fight this war for your country. That's what a patriot does. There was that side. And a lot of those people went and died. And then there was the other side, the anti-war movement, who said, no, no, you don't support a war you don't believe in. And those sides clashed. So the people who didn't go to Vietnam were called draft dodgers, and they went to Canada. Well, when President Carter came into office, one of the very first things he did was he signed an amnesty for all draft dodgers. Anyone who was a draft dodger who fled service in the Vietnam War could come back into the United States and not be prosecuted. Oh my God. It was a horrible thing in certain circles in the country. It was like someone set off an atomic bomb. Because what? They got to go and run away and they lived, and they can come back here and live as an American citizen, but my son went and fought and died, he did his duty. You could hear that argument. So it was very controversial. But Jimmy Carter thought we needed to heal the nation. And he didn't think that you could have all these people living someplace else. You had to get past this. In much the way that Gerald Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon was an attempt to heal the nation, Jimmy Carter's pardon, or amnesty, if you like, of draft dodgers was an attempt to heal the nation, except it wasn't very popular. On July 5th, 1979, Jimmy Carter addressed the nation, and he was going to speak about values and the future and about taking responsibility. But instead, that speech, while very honest and very direct, was called the malaise speech. Because what he did is he scolded the American public. He said there's a crisis of confidence in the United States, and we are all to blame for it. And he went on to talk about what we need to do to improve how we feel about ourselves and how we can do what we need to do to improve the economy. But it came off as scolding, and the Republicans had a field day. That how dare the president do this? When what he was really doing was being honest and assessing the problems in the United States and how we would solve those problems. Another thing that happened was affirmative action came into debate again. Remember, affirmative action allowed minorities greater access to housing and education and employment. And what it really meant was, if you were a non-Caucasian, you got a bounce or a boost into those areas. Well, Supreme Court case is dealt with during the Carter years, and it's called Regents of the University of California versus Busch. And what occurred in that ruling was that affirmative action was fine, but that race could not be the sole basis. The Supreme Court ruled that race could be a factor in school admissions, but that numerical quotas could not be used. It can't be for every white person you have to take a black person, and for every 50 white people, you have to take 50 black people. There had to be other factors in it. So affirmative action, while still alive and well, was still controversial as well while Jimmy Carter was president. Some really cool things that happened. The Camp David Accords. The Camp David Accords, absolutely wonderful, stellar thing that happened while Carter was president. Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, and Menachem Begin, the prime minister of Israel, are brought together in Camp David, Maryland at the presidential retreat. And Jimmy Carter, Menachem Begin, and Anwar Sadat hammer out an agreement to allow for peace between Egypt and Israel. They were historical enemies. At one point, Sadat and Begin want to run out, and they don't want to deal with this anymore because they have an old hatred. And Jimmy Carter puts himself between them, puts himself in front of the door and says, no, you're not leaving. You're not leaving till we get this. And we got it. We got a peace accord that still holds today. It's the only Mideast peace treaty, in my knowledge, that actually is still holding. Egypt and Israel are not attacking each other. Even with all the tumult that's going on in Egypt today, the Camp David Accords are holding. It's pretty cool. Under its terms, Israel agreed to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula, and Egypt became the first Arab country to recognize Israel officially. That was a huge, huge deal. Soviet-American relations. Continuing with the Jimmy Carter philosophy of let's get along in this world, he starts negotiations on what was called SALT II. SALT II was a further reduction in nuclear arms. Détente continuing, we have more discussions going on with the Soviet Union. SALT II is agreed to by Leonid Brezhnev and by Jimmy Carter, but the Senate of the United States never ratifies the treaty. So it's not a formal treaty, it's more of an agreement. And both sides abide by it anyway, even though the Senate doesn't ratify it. We have this issue of Soviet dissidents, people who were against the high-handed power of the Soviet government. And Soviets were angered by Carter's support of these dissidents. We supported these people who were speaking out against the Soviet government. But again, that was Jimmy Carter. It's human rights first, human rights second, human rights always. If you take a look at what Jimmy Carter has done as an ex-president around the world, you'll see he really believed what he was trying to sell to the American people. It didn't make him a strong president, but it made him true to his word. Then, in 1979, we get the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Here's Afghanistan. Afghanistan just doesn't seem to go away from being in the news. Late in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded neighboring Afghanistan to bolster a Soviet-supported government there. Jimmy Carter said, "What, are you kidding?" He called the invasion a clear threat, very much like the recent invasion, and we're talking in 2014, of Crimea by the Russians right now under Vladimir Putin. The Soviets invade Afghanistan. And Jimmy Carter says, "No, this is horrible, you can't do this." But his response is considered very impotent. What does he do? He turns around and he says, "Well, we're not going to go to the Olympics. We're not going to go to the Olympics. The United States is not going to participate in the Moscow Olympics." Well, I don't think the Soviet Union cared very much. And then we have the darkest part of the Carter presidency, the Iranian hostage crisis. Iran had been a friend of the United States since the Eisenhower administration had caused a coup d'etat, putting the Shah of Iran into power. We had pushed out a democratically elected government in Iran in 1953-54 time period and put in a puppet government of the United States, the Shah, Shah Reza Pahlavi, and he is here, much older. And what happened was we used a lot of American money and training of Iranian military personnel, and we gave them a lot of weapons, and the Shah was brutal to his people, but he was our brutal dictator. Well, in 1979, that came to an end when the people overthrew the Shah, and instead they put in this fundamentalist Islamic government led by the Ayatollah Khomeini, and this is the Ayatollah Khomeini. Well, the Shah fled the country. The Iranians aren't happy with us to begin with. The Shah flees the country, and first he goes to France, and then he ends up in the United States. He's diagnosed with cancer, he's not doing well, he's probably going to die. And the Iranians demand that we return the Shah. A very good movie about all of this, by the way, is Argo. Wonderful, wonderful movie, done very well. The beginning of the first 5 minutes is kind of a history lesson about what happened in Iran. Anyway, so the fundamentalists overthrow the Shah flees, ends up in the United States. They want him back. The Iranians want him back, they want him to face trial. Jimmy Carter knows that if he goes back, what's really going to happen, he's probably going to be executed, he's probably going to be hanged as a symbol for everything that has occurred for the 30 years prior to this. So anyway, Jimmy Carter allows the Shah to come to the United States for medical treatment, and he's not going to give him back. He's not going to give the Shah back. So what do the Iranians do? The Iranians seize our embassy. They go right over the walls into the American embassy, shown very well in Argo, and they take Americans hostage. And they hold those Americans hostage for 444 days. Pretty incredible. That's a long time. And for that entire time, Jimmy Carter decided he was not going to use military force to get those hostages out. There was a terrible attempt to rescue them using helicopters in the middle of the night, and what happened as a result of that was two American helicopters crashed in the desert outside of Tehran, and the Iranian news media is able to cover this the next day, and you see burned American helicopters, and you see the American helicopters cruising their charred bodies on the ground and being dragged with ropes in Iran through the streets. And Jimmy Carter gets on TV and he says, "This is my fault." And he takes full responsibility for it. It was nice he took full responsibility for it. It didn't help get the hostages released. And they stayed hostage throughout his entire presidency. He made a promise. Jimmy Carter made a promise that he would get the hostages released and that he would get them released unharmed. Oddly enough, he kept his promise. Through negotiations, he managed to get the hostages released unharmed. But they were released a half an hour after Ronald Reagan took the oath of office in January of 1981. As a matter of fact, the Carter people were negotiating with the Ayatollah's people while the Americans were on a plane in the airport in Tehran, and they hung up on the Carter team once he was no longer president. They called him back. The Carter team called him back and they said, we're not negotiating with you anymore. You're not part of this. So half an hour later, the plane is in the air and the hostages are freed. Now, are the hostages freed because they feared Ronald Reagan? Maybe. Are the hostages freed because of Carter's diplomacy? Maybe. We don't know for sure. But Jimmy Carter dedicated the last year and change of his presidency to getting those hostages freed. He didn't campaign. And strangely enough, he was up for re-election. He didn't campaign in 1980. And about 6 weeks before the election, he was still leading in the polls over Ronald Reagan. But nevertheless, the Iranian hostage crisis was the dark spot on the Carter presidency. The high point was the Camp David Accords. He also negotiated to return the Panama Canal to the Panamanians in 1999 on New Year's Eve, so we gave the Panama Canal back to the Panamanians. But Jimmy Carter will probably always be remembered as the president for the Iranian hostage crisis. And it's kind of sad, because he was so much more than that, but the Americans wanted a strong guy. They didn't want a reasonable guy. The 1980 election. By the end of the Carter administration, by the end of his term as president, he was looked at as being pretty weak, and that's unfortunate. Carter was defeated by Republican Ronald Reagan in the 1980 election because Ronald Reagan turned around and said, no, we're going to restore American honor in the world. We're going to show American power. We're not going to take this stuff. Because again, now look what's happened. Ronald Reagan is the answer to the weak presidencies of Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. Just like Gerald Ford was the answer to the dishonest president, Richard Nixon, and Jimmy Carter was the answer to the failed presidencies of Johnson, Nixon, and Ford. Ronald Reagan is the answer to the weak presidency of Jimmy Carter. Immediately following Ronald Reagan's inauguration, Iran released the hostages, and President Reagan sent Carter to greet the hostages as they arrived at Wiesbaden in West Germany at the time, because it was still West Germany and East Germany. So the 1970s was kind of a sidewards movement in American politics and American power. The Vietnam War ended largely in disgrace. There are people who say the United States did not lose the Vietnam War. We withdrew from Vietnam. Yes, we withdrew from Vietnam. However, Vietnam did fall to communism. So while the domino didn't extend throughout all of Asia, it did extend into South Vietnam. And strangely enough, today I'm talking 2014, Americans can visit Vietnam. And they can tour sites that famous battles occurred. They can tour museums, and they can see the American presence in Vietnam even today. Vietnam is a trading partner with the United States. So we can get past these things. Anyway, we're going to close here. We're going to close here with this whole idea of the Carter presidency and the Ford presidency being looked at as fairly weak during the 1970s, when American power in the world was looked at as fairly weak coming out of the Vietnam War. You can find this PowerPoint and other materials at www.buschistory.net, topic 27. The next topic will be topic 28, and it'll be the Reagan-Bush era, 12 years of a common philosophy in the United States government. Keep the emails coming. More came this week. We are approaching the AP exam. This is April 1st, and the AP exam is about 5 weeks away. So yes, we will finish. We will finish the entire course by the time of the exam. And maybe if there's time, we'll do a little review. But also remember, there are a whole series of review timelines under Bush History on YouTube as well. And I'll put some of the links to those on the website. So for today, I'm David Busch. Have a great day. Thanks for joining us.